The billionaire's kids fired every tutor until one teacher uncovered their mother's secret. They thought no one could outlast their games, no one could stand against their arrogance. But this time, they were wrong. Because the moment you walked into that mansion, you weren't just fighting for respect, you were walking straight into a mystery that would change everything. And it all begins the day the teacher first laid eyes on the mansion that had devoured so many tutors before them. The first time the teacher saw it, the mansion didn't just stand, it loomed, casting a shadow across the sprawling gardens that stretched for acres. Iron gates taller than most houses creaked open like the jaws of a sleeping beast, and behind them a driveway unrolled longer than some city blocks. Every stone, every column, every towering window whispered the same warning. This was not a home. It was a fortress. The car rolled to a stop before steps so wide they looked like they belonged to a palace. The driver said nothing as he handed over the teacher's bag. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything. Good luck. You'll need it. Then he drove away, leaving the teacher alone at the foot of the great doors. When those doors opened, the air itself seemed to shift. Heavy, perfumed, artificial, as though the house was trying to mask something rotten beneath its polished surfaces. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across marble floors polished to glass. Long carpets stretched like runways into hallways lined with gold-framed portraits. Yet none of it felt welcoming. The house felt alive, watching, waiting, testing. The staff moved quietly around the newcomer, polite but distant, smiles thin, eyes lowered, voices hushed. They had seen this scene too many times before. Tutors arrived with degrees and confidence, only to leave in tears or humiliation. Some lasted weeks, some days, a few didn't even survive their first lesson. Every time, the children won. Every time, the staff watched another teacher walk back through those iron gates defeated, while laughter echoed from the windows above. And then there they were. 3 figures appeared at the top of the grand staircase, standing like young royalty surveying their kingdom. Clothes tailored to perfection, posture sharp, eyes sharper still. They didn't rush down. They didn't greet the newcomer. They stood still, smirking, as if to say, "Here's another one. Let's see how long this one lasts." The rumors had been true. These were the children who devoured. Tutors. They twisted every rule, mocked every mistake, and took pride in every departure. But as the teacher studied them, a flicker of something else surfaced. Their cruelty was too precise, too rehearsed. Not arrogance, it was armor. Still, the war had already begun. The mansion had swallowed every tutor before, but this time it would not, because the children's rebellion wasn't born of boredom. It was protection, and the secret they guarded wasn't theirs. It belonged to the one person no tutor ever dared to confront their mother. The mansion carried the echoes of failure like scars etched into its bones. No one needed to hand the new teacher a file of reports. The story was already there, woven into the silence that hung heavy in every corridor. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, yet they seemed to echo with the hurried footsteps of those who had walked them before. Tutors came with determination in their stride and hope in their hearts, but the echoes always ended the same way, in retreat, in humiliation, in defeat. The house seemed to collect those endings, storing them like trophies in its very walls. It was the staff who revealed the truth, though never with words meant for the teacher's ears. Their silence was telling enough. The cook avoided eye contact when she delivered meals, her lips pressed into a tight line. The maids hurried through the halls, shoulders tense, as if lingering too long near the children's quarters might invite disaster. And in the servants' hall, where the air was warmer and voices usually softer, whispers slipped out when they thought no one was listening. The last one didn't even last a month. 3 weeks, wasn't it? She was brilliant, but she cried herself to sleep every night. Do you remember the French tutor? Poor woman, she bolted into the rain without her coat, like the devil himself was after her. The moment the head butler entered the room, the whispers died as if cut by a blade, replaced by the clatter of cutlery and the scrape of chairs. But the fear lingered in their eyes, unspoken yet unmistakable. Everyone in that house knew the truth. Any tutor who entered was already walking into a battle they weren't meant to win. The children carried that legacy like a crown, They spoke of the fallen tutors with an ease that chilled the air. The eldest, sharp and commanding, delivered the stories with the precision of a historian, his tone cold and detached. The English tutor who thought she was clever, I corrected her grammar in front of the entire class. She never came back after that. The middle child, quick-witted and mischievous, added with a smirk, "Remember the math tutor? She messed up a formula, and I never let her forget it. She quit 2 days later." Then the youngest, quiet but calculating, leaned forward and whispered, almost with satisfaction, "The science tutor locked herself in the bathroom for hours." We pretended not to hear her crying. When they finished, the three of them laughed together. It wasn't the laughter of children who had won a game. It was sharper, harder, a sound rehearsed so well it carried like a performance. To most people, that laughter would have sounded like victory, a celebration of their cruelty. But to the teacher, it sounded hollow, forced. It rang too sharply, as though they weren't laughing from joy, but rather burying something beneath the sound, pushing down an unease they didn't dare name. It was in those moments that the teacher began to notice the cracks. For all their arrogance, there were subjects they never touched. They made jokes about fathers and tutors, mocked mistakes, and twisted every lesson into a spectacle, but they never spoke of their mother. The moment her name was mentioned, their eyes dimmed, their laughter cut off mid-breath, and silence fell like a curtain. It wasn't casual avoidance. It was instinctive, almost primal, and it was laced with fear. That silence told the teacher everything. These children weren't the villains that rumor had painted them to be. Their cruelty wasn't born from boredom or entitlement. It was armor polished and sharpened over years of necessity. Every cruel word, every mocking laugh, every sabotage in the classroom was part of a performance designed to protect something that lived not in them, but in the shadow of their mother. The teacher carried that realization into the night, long after the lessons were finished. Alone in the heavy silence of the guest room, staring at the ceiling carved with ornate patterns, they couldn't shake the thought. The children weren't trying to destroy tutors for sport. They were warning them away, keeping them from digging too deeply, guarding the secret that threatened to tear the entire household apart. And that secret belonged to her. The first lesson inside that mansion was never about learning. Not here. Not in this house. The first lesson was a trial, a test of survival, and the teacher felt it the moment they stepped into the study. The room itself seemed built to intimidate. Shelves lined with leather-bound books that smelled of dust and money, chandeliers that hung like watchful eyes, and a long oak table polished so perfectly it reflected every breath. The silence in the room was heavy, like a stage waiting for its actors to arrive. And then the children entered. They didn't come carrying notebooks or pencils. They came armed with smirks. The eldest moved first, taking the center chair with the commanding air of a monarch holding court. His voice was smooth and deliberate, the kind of voice that had grown accustomed to being obeyed. "Well, start when we're ready," he declared, his gaze sharp. "Not when you say so." The second child leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his grin full of mischief. "Why don't you tell us about yourself?" he said, his tone mocking. "That's what all the others did, right before they quit." His words carried the sting of bait, meant to lure the teacher into the same trap that had ensnared so many before. The youngest didn't speak. He sat quietly at the edge of the table, his posture too still, his eyes too sharp. He studied the teacher like a puzzle waiting to be solved, as if cataloging every movement, every twitch, every breath. His silence was not shyness. It was strategy. This was their ritual, their opening move. They wanted the teacher to stumble over their introduction, to scramble for respect, to reveal some weakness they could turn into a weapon. That was how it always began. False confidence followed by humiliation. Tutors before had fallen into this trap. Their credentials and stories twisted into jokes, their confidence chipped away piece by piece until there was nothing left. But this teacher wasn't like the others. They didn't boast about degrees. They didn't recite achievements or list credentials. Instead, the teacher leaned forward calmly, resting their hands on the polished table. Their voice was steady, clear, and quiet enough to cut through the children's smirks like a blade. You fired every tutor before me, they said. That makes me curious, not about who they were, but about why you wanted them gone. The shift was immediate. The eldest blinked just once, but it was enough to betray surprise. The second child forced a laugh, but it cracked halfway, too sharp to be convincing. And the youngest, he broke his stare, glancing briefly away before his eyes snapped back. It was the smallest of moments, but it was the first crack in their armor. From there, the battle began in earnest. The eldest tried to dominate, interrupting with corrections, testing the teacher's patience. The middle child mocked openly, repeating phrases in a high-pitched tone, waiting for the teacher to break. The youngest bided his time, subtle in his sabotage an ink bottle knocked over by accident, a torn page left as bait, random questions barked out not to learn, but to derail. But the teacher didn't falter. They didn't scold, didn't shout, didn't crumble as the others had. Instead, they turned every trick back onto the children. When the ink spilled, they handed cloths to the culprits and made them clean their own mess, turning it into a lesson on accountability. When questions were shouted to derail, the teacher dissected them calmly, twisting the interruptions into real discussions that forced the children to participate. When the torn book page was revealed, the teacher asked the children to explain what had been lost and why it mattered. Every attempt at sabotage became a lesson in disguise. Every cruelty transformed into an opportunity for growth. By the end of that first hour, the children were no longer smirking. Their laughter had dulled, their jabs softened, their eyes no longer gleamed with the certainty of victory. Instead, three pairs of eyes stared at the teacher, no longer mocking, but cautious. The eldest finally leaned forward, his voice low and challenging. You think you're different from the others, but you're not. The teacher met his stare without hesitation, their voice calm and certain. Well, see. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was not the same silence as before. It wasn't arrogant or mocking, it was uncertain, weighted with the realization that they had finally met someone who wouldn't crumble. For the first time, the children were staring not at a victim, but at an opponent. The war of wits had begun. And though they didn't realize it yet, every game they played, every cruel trick they devised, every wall of arrogance they raised was not pushing the teacher away, it was pushing the teacher closer to the truth they were so desperate to hide. A truth that wasn't theirs, a truth that belonged to her. It didn't take long for the teacher to notice that the children's cruelty was only half the story. For all their rehearsed arrogance and sharpened games, there were moments when their masks slipped, and in those moments, the truth peeked through. The change always came suddenly, like a draft of cold air sweeping through the room. One moment they were predators, circling the teacher with smirks and mockery. The next, they were prey, shrinking back, their eyes darting toward the door as though expecting a storm to crash through at any second. The trigger was always the same, the sound of footsteps in the marble halls. The sharp click of heels echoing down the corridor carried a power that stilled their laughter and froze their movements. The air itself seemed to tense, waiting. It wasn't their father who commanded such fear. The billionaire himself was little more than a rumor inside the house. His name was whispered in connection to meetings and boardrooms, but never spoken at the dinner table. When the children mentioned him, their voices were indifferent, almost dismissive. He was absent, a ghost who owned everything but occupied nothing. The true force in the mansion was their mother. The first time the teacher saw her, the entire atmosphere shifted like clouds rolling across the sun. One moment the children were daring and sharp-tongued, testing boundaries with wicked grins. The next they were statues, spines stiffening, hands folding neatly in their laps, their voices dying mid-sentence. Fear had a way of silencing them before she even appeared. And then she arrived. She didn't simply enter a room, she possessed it. Draped in silk that shimmered with each graceful movement, jewels glittering at her throat and wrists, she glided forward with the poise of someone who knew the world belonged to her. Her face was flawless, her makeup sharp enough to wound, her hair pinned so precisely that not a single strand dared to stray. She was beauty sculpted into perfection, but her presence pressed down on the room like a storm cloud, suffocating and relentless. Her smile was the first lie. It curved sweetly, elegantly, but there was no warmth in it. It was performance, a weapon polished to gleam. And when she spoke, her voice was low and smooth, carrying the kind of power that didn't need to rise above a whisper to be obeyed. "Ah," she said, her eyes sweeping over the teacher with a cold precision, "the new tutor." There was no greeting, no handshake, no acknowledgement of name or identity. To her, the teacher's existence was summarized by those two words, new and temporary. She had seen many before, and she expected to see many after. The children, so bold and mocking only moments before, now sat frozen under her gaze. The eldest, usually brimming with authority, lowered his eyes and clenched his fists tightly against the table. The second, who had laughed loudest and mocked the hardest, swallowed nervously, his grin gone. The youngest didn't even dare to glance up. His hands curled into fists beneath the tablecloth, hidden from view, his jaw tight, his silence trembling with effort. "My darlings," she cooed, her voice dripping with sugar so thick it almost hid the venom beneath. "How clever you look today. Always making me proud." They nodded quickly, too quickly, like puppets eager to avoid the tug of strings. The teacher watched as the proud, defiant heirs to a billionaire's empire shrank into obedient dolls, their independence erased in a heartbeat. And then her gaze returned to the teacher. She tilted her head, her flawless smile holding steady, her eyes gleaming with something colder. "I trust you'll do better than the others." The words sounded like encouragement, but the weight beneath them was anything but. It was not a wish for success. It was a warning, a dare, a line drawn in the marble floor. And then, as suddenly as she had arrived, she was gone. A sweep of silk through the doorway, the echo of her heels fading into the corridor, her perfume lingering like a ghost long after her departure. The moment the door shut, the children exhaled sharply, as though they had been holding their breath the entire time. Shoulders slumped, faces slackened, and the tension bled out of their bodies. But none of them spoke. They didn't look at each other. They didn't look at the teacher. They sat in silence as if even words might betray them to the woman whose shadow stretched over every inch of the house. In that silence, the teacher understood what the staff whispers and the children's cruelty had only hinted at. Their rebellion wasn't random mischief or idle malice. It was armor, a shield they had raised against her, against their mother, against the storm she carried with her into every room. The children weren't guarding themselves from tutors. They were guarding the one secret no outsider had ever dared to confront, the secret their mother had buried deep within the mansion's walls. The mansion at night was not the same place it pretended to be in daylight. By day, it dazzled with chandeliers scattering brilliance across marble floors, gilded mirrors reflecting endless corridors, and sunlight pouring through tall windows like liquid gold. But when darkness fell, the same beauty turned hollow, its grandeur twisting into something unsettling. The chandeliers hung lifeless and heavy, their crystals clicking faintly in the drafts. The portraits that lined the walls, painted in severe detail, seemed to follow with eyes too watchful, too knowing. Even the silence had weight, a suffocating stillness broken only by the groan of old wood or the sudden slam of a door no one had touched. Sleep did not come easily in that house. The teacher lay awake on the ornate bed in the guest chamber, staring at carved ceilings, the hush of the night pressing against their chest like a weight. Every creak in the floorboards sounded like a warning. Every gust of wind against the window felt like a whisper in the dark. And then it came a sound that didn't belong. 3 soft knocks at the door, hesitant, fragile. Not the confident knock of a servant delivering orders, but the trembling tap of someone unsure if they even wanted to be heard. When the teacher opened the door, the youngest child stood there. His frame looked even smaller in the glow of the hallway lamps, his silk pajamas swallowing his thin body, his face pale and tired. The sharp, calculating eyes he wore during the day were gone, replaced by something rawer fear. He clutched at his sleeve as though it were a lifeline, and when he spoke, his voice cracked into a whisper. "Can I come in?" The teacher nodded, stepping aside. The boy slipped inside quickly, closing the door with careful hands, as though even the faint click of the latch might betray him. He perched on the edge of the desk chair, stiff as a soldier at attention, his feet dangling above the floor. The tension in his body was coiled so tightly it looked painful, every muscle straining against silence. For a long time, he said nothing. The seconds dragged, the quiet between them deepening until it felt unbearable. At last, in a voice so soft it nearly vanished, the boy spoke. "We don't hate tutors." The words landed like stones in still water. The teacher leaned forward, their breath catching. "What do you mean?" His small hands twisted together, knuckles pale. "We don't hate them. He faltered, swallowing hard. His lips trembled as though the words themselves might betray him. Finally, he buried his face in his hands. When he looked up again, his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "We just want someone to see the truth, but no one ever does. They don't last long enough. They all leave before they understand. And she—" He cut himself off sharply, flinching at the word he almost spoke. His gaze flicked toward the door as though the very walls had ears. "She who?" the teacher asked softly, though they already knew the answer forming in their mind. His lips parted, then closed again. His jaw clenched, his fists trembled. When he finally spoke, the word escaped like a ghost pulled from his throat. Mother. One word, one fragile word that carried the weight of every silence, every nervous glance, every cruel laugh that died at the sound of footsteps in the hall. That single word confirmed everything. The mother wasn't just a presence in their lives. She was the storm at the center of their fear. The boy's eyes lifted, searching the teacher's face as though testing whether they could be trusted with this dangerous truth. His voice broke as he whispered, "She tells us what to say, what to do, even how to laugh. And if we don't," his sentence dissolved, swallowed by fear. He bit his lips so hard it whitened, his silence screaming louder than any words could. The teacher's voice softened, careful not to push too hard. "If you don't, what happens?" The boy shook his head violently, as though even imagining the answer could summon it. His eyes filled with tears, his body trembling with the effort of holding them back. He wanted to tell more desperately, but fear had built a cage around him, and he could not break it. Suddenly, he stood. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, his fragile mask slipping back into place. "You should leave," he whispered. His voice cracked, but he forced himself to continue. "Before she notices you, before she decides you've seen too much." The words sent a chill through the teacher's body. For all the cruelty this boy had shown in daylight, what stood before them now was not an arrogant heir, but a child begging for protection, not for himself, but for the stranger who had dared to stay. He moved toward the door, his small hand trembling on the brass handle. He paused, shoulders hunched under a weight no child should bear. His voice, when it came, was softer than breath, almost a plea. "Don't trust her." And then he slipped out, swallowed by the darkness of the hallway, leaving the teacher in a silence that felt heavier than before. The warning echoed in the still air. Don't trust her. For the first time since stepping into that mansion, the teacher understood. The children's cruelty wasn't a game. It wasn't mischief born of privilege. It was survival. Their rebellion was a shield, forged in fear of the one person who ruled over them with an invisible hand. And now, that the truth had been whispered at midnight, there was no turning back. Secrets like that don't disappear, they grow louder, stronger, and they demand to be uncovered. The mansion was a labyrinth, not just in design, but in rules. Every hallway carried its own silent laws, invisible lines no one dared to cross. The teacher noticed it quickly, how the servants moved freely through certain corridors, but avoided others with deliberate care. Their gazes never lingered, their steps quickened near particular doors. The house was polished perfection, yet one corridor stood apart. It was darker than the rest, even in daylight. The curtains in that part of the house were always drawn, the air thick with a stale chill. The handles of the doors gleamed from polish, but no hands ever turned them. Not a tray of food, not a sweep of a feather duster ever passed that way. The silence there was unnatural, alive, as though something hidden inside pressed outward. The children noticed when the teacher's eyes lingered on that corridor. They reacted quickly, deliberately pulling attention away. The eldest would roll his eyes with exaggerated boredom. The middle one would jeer, mocking the teacher for staring at shadows. But the youngest never mocked. His gaze carried warning, his lips tight, his silence louder than words. Every time the teacher passed that hallway, he would watch with fear rather than scorn, as if begging silently, "Don't go there." But the house had a way of pulling intruders toward its secrets. It happened late one evening. Lessons had ended, books were closed, yet the children lingered instead of scattering. Their usual defiance was absent, replaced by a silence heavy and strange. The eldest sat stiff, his jaw locked. The middle one chewed nervously at his lip, his eyes darting toward the forbidden corridor. And the youngest fidgeted in his chair, his fingers twitching as though itching to reach for the teacher's hand. Finally, it was the middle child who broke the silence. His voice was low, stripped of its usual mockery. "You want to know why the others left, don't you?" The eldest snapped his head toward him, eyes sharp with warning. "Don't," he hissed. But the middle child pressed on, his shoulders trembling. "They didn't leave because of us." "Not really. They left because of what they saw." The words hung in the air like a blade. The room seemed to grow colder, the fire in the hearth flickering low. The youngest whispered, "We shouldn't," but he didn't finish. His eyes flicked toward the hallway, dread etched into his small features. The teacher rose slowly, heart pounding, and the middle child gave a single nod. "Follow." The eldest muttered a curse but didn't stop them. The youngest trailed reluctantly, his wide eyes darting to the ceiling as though expecting their mother's shadow to descend at any moment. Together, the three led the teacher through the mansion's echoing corridors until they stood before it, the forbidden wing. At first glance, the door at the end looked no different from the others, tall, wooden, carved with ornate roses and vines. But up close, the truth revealed itself. The brass handles were icy cold, untouched for so long they seemed to repel warmth. Dust gathered in the carved grooves, a silent testament to years of avoidance. The very air around it felt heavier, thicker, as though the door itself exhaled secrets. "This is where they stopped coming back," the eldest said, his voice quiet and stripped of arrogance. For the first time, he looked afraid. The teacher placed a hand on the handle. The chill sank deep into their skin, unnatural in its intensity. With a push, the door groaned, its hinges crying like a wounded animal. The sound echoed down the hallway, too loud, too alive. And then the door opened. Inside, the air was heavy and stagnant, carrying the faint, cloying scent of perfume gone sour with time. Dust motes drifted in the thin shafts of light that managed to slip through cracks in the curtains. The room was a world apart from the pristine perfection of the rest of the mansion. Here, the surfaces weren't polished, the shelves weren't orderly. It was cluttered, chaotic, suffocating. On one wall hung portraits, not the grand regal paintings displayed in the main hall, but smaller, intimate ones, family photographs. At first, they seemed ordinary. The billionaire father, younger, thinner, his arm around his wife. The children, still infants, dressed in silks and lace. But something about them gnawed at the edges of the teacher's mind. In every photograph, the father aged. His face softened, his hairline receded, his body changed with time, but the mother, she remained exactly the same, her eyes sharp, her face flawless, untouched, ageless, as though time itself dared not lay a hand on her. The teacher's stomach twisted. In the far corner stood a desk cluttered with papers, letters half burned in the fireplace beside it. The teacher leaned closer, scanning the fragments, smudged ink, torn phrases. "Keep this hidden," one read. Another, desperate. "If they ever find out, everything is lost." Then the teacher saw a photograph half buried beneath the pile. Dust clung to its edges, the image faded but clear enough. The mother stood smiling, flawless as always, her arm linked tightly with a man who was not the billionaire. He was younger, darker, his gaze possessive, his hand gripping her waist like a claim. On the back, scrawled in hurried handwriting, was a name the teacher didn't recognize. The children lingered at the threshold, their bodies rigid, their faces pale. None of them crossed into the room. The eldest clenched his fists. The middle one stared at the floor, and the youngest whispered, voice trembling, "We shouldn't be here." If she finds out he didn't finish, he didn't have to. The truth pulsed in the air around them. This wasn't just a locked wing, it was a vault built not to preserve memories, but to bury them, a vault filled with fragments of a truth the mother had spent her life concealing, and now the teacher had stepped inside it. The rules of the game had just changed. From the moment the teacher stepped out of the forbidden wing, the mansion itself seemed to change. Its silence grew heavier, its air thicker, as though the walls knew a line had been crossed. Every polished surface, every golden frame seemed to hold its breath. The children, too, moved differently. Their laughter, sharp, mocking, rehearsed no longer, carried its usual bite. They still tried their tricks, still tested the teacher with small rebellions, but the heat had drained out of it. Their defiance felt brittle now, fragile, as though it could shatter under the wrong word. Something in them had shifted, and the teacher knew why. It wasn't long before she appeared, not in passing, not in the distant glide of silk at the far end of the hall. This time the mother arrived fully, deliberately, as though she had chosen her moment with surgical precision. The children and the teacher were seated in the study, their books spread across the table, when the doors opened with a slow, deliberate groan. Her heels struck the marble floor in a steady rhythm, sharp as a metronome, announcing her presence before her voice did. She entered like a storm dressed in silk. Her gown shimmered with every movement, her jewels flashing in the dim light, her posture regal, untouchable. The very air bent to her will. The children froze, pens stilled, backs straightened. Their voices died in their throats. Even their breathing seemed controlled, measured, as though she might notice the rhythm of it. "How are my darlings today?" she asked, her voice velvet smooth, laced with sugar that tasted like poison. She leaned casually against the eldest's chair, her manicured hand sliding down the polished wood, her smile dazzling and cold. Her gaze swept the children briefly, but it lingered on the teacher far too long. The teacher answered carefully, their tone even. "They're progressing well. They're bright, capable." The mother tilted her head. "Bright," she repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. "Capable." Her smile sharpened, but her eldest son's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. Her words were not praise, they were a warning cloaked in silk. She moved through the room like a predator circling prey, her heels clicking softly against the floorboards. Every few steps, she asked a question not to her children, but to the teacher, about methods, about expectations, about influence. Her tone was calm, but beneath it was something sharper, colder, a blade hidden in satin. When the teacher answered, she leaned closer, bending at the waist so her lips hovered near their ear. Her perfume was heavy, suffocating. "Structure, not freedom," she whispered, her voice too low for the children to hear. "Children need discipline. Too much freedom makes them forget their place." Her nails tapped lightly against the back of the teacher's chair. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm was steady, deliberate, almost like a countdown. The children did not move. They did not breathe. The room was frozen, heavy with fear. And in that silence, the teacher realized this moment wasn't about the children at all. It was about them. The mother wasn't testing her children. She was testing the teacher. Still, the cracks were beginning to show. The teacher spoke of history, of rulers who thrived on truth versus empires that crumbled under deceit. It was only a lesson, an example for the children, but the mother's reaction was instant. Her head snapped toward the teacher, her flawless smile faltering. For a single heartbeat, her mask slipped. The warmth drained from her face, her eyes sharpened into something raw fear, rage, recognition. The eldest child stiffened in his seat, his shoulders tight, bracing for the storm. The room seemed to hold its breath, and then as quickly as it came, the mask returned. Her lips curved into a smile once more, her eyes softened, her voice dipped back into syrup. But the teacher had seen it. They had seen beneath the mask, if only for a moment. The mother straightened and continued her circuit around the table. When she reached the teacher again, her hand came to rest on their shoulder, her touch cool and steady as iron. "I admire your dedication," she said sweetly, though her nails pressed against the fabric like claws. "But some things in this house are not for you to understand. Some doors must stay closed." With that, she glided out, leaving only her perfume and silence in her wake. The door shut with a soft click, but its echo carried like thunder. The children sat motionless, their pens poised over blank pages, their masks pulled tight once more. But slowly, one by one, their eyes lifted. They didn't speak. They didn't dare. Yet in their wide, fearful gazes, the teacher saw something else, something fragile, flickering like a candle in a storm. Hope. They knew the teacher had seen it too. They knew the mask had slipped. The game had changed. The silence after the mother's departure was unbearable. It filled the study like smoke, seeping into every corner, curling into the lungs, making it impossible to breathe. The teacher sat still, their heart hammering, while the children remained frozen in their seats, their pens poised over paper, eyes fixed downward. They looked like statues, obedient, perfect, controlled. But beneath the stillness, something trembled. Their fingers twitched. Their shoulders rose and fell too quickly. They were straining against an invisible chain. The teacher didn't speak. Instinct warned them that to break the silence too soon would shatter the fragile balance and send the children retreating back behind their walls. So they waited. The seconds stretched, heavy and suffocating, until finally the eldest lifted his head. His eyes were wide, searching the teacher's face, desperate for confirmation. His voice cracked as he whispered, "You saw it, didn't you? The way she looked at you. You saw what's underneath." The teacher nodded once, steady and careful. The eldest exhaled sharply, relief flickering across his features, though fear rushed back almost immediately. "She pretends," he said, his voice low, trembling, "always pretending, smiling, controlling. But you saw it the way her mask slips." The middle child shifted nervously, his leg bouncing beneath the table. His gaze darted to the door, then back to the teacher, as though measuring the seconds they had before danger returned. "If we tell, she'll punish us," he muttered, his words heavy with dread. The youngest, sitting small and pale in his chair, blurted out in a trembling voice, "She'll lock us away again." His hands flew to his mouth as if he hadn't meant to say it aloud. Tears welled in his eyes. "She'll make us disappear. Again." That single word froze the teacher's blood. Again meant it had already happened before. The eldest's jaw clenched, his voice rising despite the fear etched across his face. "She already punishes us. Every day. For breathing wrong, for asking questions, for remembering father." His voice cracked on the word father. His fists clenched so tight the skin over his knuckles turned white. "She wants us to forget him. To forget everything before this house." The middle child leaned forward, his tone steadier than his siblings, but his eyes betrayed him. "We hear things at night," he said. "We hear her talking. To people who never come through the front door. About papers, about money, about what father knew." He paused, his voice tightening. "About what she's hiding." The teacher leaned in, whispering, coaxing gently. "If you tell me, I'll believe you. I won't leave. You can trust me." For a moment, none of them moved. Fear hung in the air like a thick fog. Then the eldest spoke again, his voice raw with desperation. "It's about her past, before the money, before all this." He gestured around the room, the chandeliers, the gilded frames, the marble floors. "She doesn't want anyone to know who she was, what she did. That's why father's gone. That's why she locks us in here." The youngest whimpered, shaking his head violently. "Don't say it. Don't say it." But the eldest pressed on, his voice breaking. "We saw the papers she keeps hidden. Old letters, photographs, things about father's will. She doesn't want anyone to find them. Not us, not the tutors, not anyone." The middle child's eyes locked on the teacher's, sharp and piercing. "That's why no one stays. She makes them leave the moment they start asking questions, the moment they start piecing it together. She knows. She always knows." The teacher swallowed hard, their throat dry. What secret is she hiding? The eldest's lips parted, trembling. He looked at his siblings, then back at the teacher. His chest rose and fell in shallow, frantic breaths. He wanted to speak. He wanted someone to know. And then, the smallest voice broke the air. "She killed him." The youngest words were so soft they almost vanished, but they struck like a lightning bolt through the room. The eldest flinched, as though struck. The middle child grabbed his sister's arm, hissing, "Don't say that! Don't ever say that!" Panic filled his eyes, his body shaking with terror. The teacher's blood turned to ice, killed him. Did she mean the father? Someone else? The words echoed, heavy and dangerous, refusing to be ignored. The eldest lunged forward suddenly, gripping the teacher's hands across the desk, his touch desperate and trembling. "You have to understand," he whispered. "If you stay, you're in danger too. She won't let you leave if you know. And if you get too close," his voice trailed off, strangled by fear. The youngest was sobbing now, her hands pressed over her mouth as though she could stuff the words back inside her. The middle child's face was pale, his eyes darting toward the door like prey sensing the predator's return. "We shouldn't have said anything," he whispered fiercely. "She'll know. She always knows." And then it happened. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing down the marble corridor. The children froze, terror draining the color from their faces. In a heartbeat, their masks snapped back into place. Backs straightened, pens lowered to pages, eyes downcast. Perfect little dolls once more. The footsteps stopped outside the door. The handle turned. The hinges groaned. The door creaked open. The teacher's breath caught. Whoever entered now would change everything, because in that moment, they were seconds away from learning whether the children's whispered testimony was only frightened tales or the truth about a secret dark enough to destroy them all. The door opened, and there she was. The mother stepped into the study, her silhouette framed by the golden glow of the chandelier in the hallway. For a fleeting second, the teacher wondered if she had been standing there longer than she let on, listening, watching, waiting for the right moment to appear. The thought sent a chill crawling down the teacher's spine, though their face remained calm, a mask carefully held in place. Her heels clicked against the marble floor in an unhurried rhythm, each step an assertion of dominance. She moved with the kind of confidence that belonged to someone who didn't just own the house, but believed she owned every soul inside it. The children reacted instantly. Whatever fear or desperation had filled their eyes seconds earlier vanished beneath the masks they had been trained to wear. Pens scratched against paper, spines straightened, eyes dropped to the pages before them. Their whispers of rebellion were gone, swallowed by silence. It was like watching marionettes snap back onto their strings the moment their puppeteer entered the room. Her smile sparkled as she swept her gaze over them. My, she murmured, her voice as smooth as velvet laced with steel, so studious, so obedient. What a picture! Her eyes lingered on the teacher longer than they should have, the weight of her gaze sharp and cutting. "You must be quite the teacher to manage what so many others could not." The words were framed as praise, but beneath them lay accusation. It was not admiration, it was suspicion, a test to see how the teacher would respond. The teacher answered evenly, refusing to let fear crack their tone. "They're intelligent," they said. "They learn quickly when they feel safe enough to do so." For just a moment, something flickered across her face. Her eyes narrowed, her lips tightened, but then the mask returned, polished and flawless. Still, the teacher knew the words had struck her. Safe enough. The phrase lingered in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. She moved behind her eldest son and rested her hand on his shoulder. He stiffened immediately, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his pen. She stroked his hair slowly, her touch tender on the surface, but carrying the weight of ownership more than love. Her voice lowered, directed at the teacher. "Children need discipline," she said. "Without discipline, they become wild, rebellious, ungrateful. Don't you agree?" The teacher held her gaze, feeling the trap in the question. Agree, and they would become complicit in her control. Disagree, and they would challenge her authority in front of her children. Either way, she would learn exactly where they stood. The teacher kept their voice calm. "They need guidance," they said. "Guidance that helps them stand on their own." Silence followed, a silence heavy enough to bend the air. The children sat frozen, not daring to react. Finally, the mother moved again, circling the table with unhurried steps, her perfume thickening the room with every pass. When she reached the teacher's chair, she stopped, Her hand slid across the wooden backrest, her nails tapping lightly in a slow rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was deliberate, almost hypnotic. "You've lasted longer than the others," she whispered, her voice low, meant only for the teacher. But they all thought they could change something too. They all thought they could win the children's trust. "Do you know where they are now?" The teacher said nothing, their jaw tight. She leaned closer, her breath brushing the side of their face. Gone. Every one of them, because they didn't learn the rule. The teacher forced their voice to remain steady. And what rule is that? Her lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She leaned closer, her whisper slicing through the air like a blade. "This is my house, my family, my secrets. No one touches them but me. Remember that if you want to last." Then, just as suddenly, she pulled away. Her mask snapped back into place, her posture regal, her expression once again polished to perfection. She smiled brightly, her voice ringing with artificial sweetness as she addressed her children. "You're all doing wonderfully. Keep it up." And then she was gone. She paused only at the doorway, turning her head ever so slightly. "I trust you'll remember your place," she said, her words delicate and sharp at once, "for your own sake." The door closed with a soft click, and the silence that followed was deafening. The children didn't look at the teacher. They didn't speak, didn't even breathe too loudly. Their faces were masks once more, but their bodies betrayed them. Tiny hands trembled as they clutched pens. Shoulders remained rigid, spines locked in unnatural stiffness. Fear had been carved into them so deeply, it had become second nature. The teacher sat still, their pulse thundering in their ears, realization settling like cold water in their chest. She knew. She might not have known exactly what her children had confessed, but she sensed it. She had seen the tremor in their posture, the shift in the teacher's tone, the fragile crack in the perfect illusion she worked so hard to maintain. And now she would be watching everything, every word, every glance, every breath. From this moment on, the teacher wasn't just another tutor in her eyes. They were a threat. And in this house, threats didn't survive for long. The days following her warning were suffocating. The mansion seemed to tighten around the teacher like a net, every corner heavy with suspicion, every shadow a reminder that she was watching. Lessons no longer felt like lessons, but performances staged for unseen eyes. Every word had to be chosen carefully, every gesture measured, every silence stretched too long felt like a risk. The children sensed it too. Their rebellion, once sharp and constant, dulled to near silence. They sat stiff and cautious, their small defiance buried under the weight of her presence. Even when she wasn't in the room, survival had become their only subject. But fear has a way of sharpening the senses. The teacher began to notice details they might have overlooked before. The odd patterns of the staff, the way conversations died the moment she entered, the way no one ever met her gaze, the hallways that bustled with movement in some places, but remained eerily empty in others. And then there was the corridor one too pristine, too quiet, the doors gleaming but never touched. The teacher had seen it before, felt its strange weight, but now they understood. That was where the truth was buried. It was late one evening when the discovery finally came. The children had retreated upstairs, their faces pale, their bodies slumped with exhaustion, not of study, but of fear. The teacher lingered behind in the study, stacking papers slowly, listening to the silence press against the windows. That was when they heard it. A sound so faint it could have been imagined. A low, steady hum, mechanical, rhythmic. Not the hum of a refrigerator or the whir of air conditioning. This was deeper, older, alive. The sound pulled at them like a thread. Step by cautious step, the teacher followed it through the dim corridors. The further they went, the cooler the air became, the shadows thickening around them. The hum grew louder, vibrating faintly through the walls. Then came another sensation draft, brushing their skin, carrying with it a smell that curdled the stomach. Metallic, sharp, like rust, like iron, like blood. And then they saw it, a door, taller than the rest, painted to match the wall so precisely it could almost vanish. But the faint outline of its frame betrayed it, and the lock confirmed it. Not an ordinary lock, but reinforced steel, the kind used for vaults, not family rooms. The teacher froze, breath shallow, pulse pounding in their ears. Every instinct screamed to turn back. But something about that door pulled them closer, as though gravity itself had shifted. They reached out, fingertips brushing the cold metal handle. The chill that shot through their skin was unnatural, as if the door itself rejected touch. It was locked, of course, but the draft seeping through the edges was real. The hum vibrated stronger here, pressing against their chest like a second heartbeat. They leaned closer, straining to listen, and caught another sound, the faint scrape of metal against concrete, like chains being dragged across the floor. The hair on their arms stood on end. Then footsteps. The teacher's heart lurched. They ducked into the shadows of a tall grandfather clock, pressing their body against the wood as the sound grew closer. The click of heels echoed steadily down the hall, sharp and certain. The rhythm was unmistakable. It was her. She emerged from the shadows, gliding with unhurried confidence, her gown whispering across the floor. A thin chain of keys dangled from her hand, glinting in the dim light. She didn't pause. She didn't look around. This was her territory, her sanctuary, and she moved through it like a queen secure in her dominion. The teacher held their breath, the clocks ticking deafening in their ears as she reached the door. With practiced ease, she selected the largest key and slid it into the lock. A low click, the groan of heavy metal. The door opened, just enough for the hum to spill into the hallway. Stronger now, almost alive. The scent hit again, thicker, sharper. Not only metallic this time, but laced with something else. Dust, paper, chemicals, the mingled scent of records and rot. From the shadows, the teacher saw only a glimpse, but it was enough to freeze their blood. Shelves, stacks of boxes, each labeled with dates stretching back decades. Binders lined up too neatly, as though someone had cataloged every breath of the family's history. But it wasn't the shelves that struck deepest. On the far wall, illuminated faintly by the light inside, hung a framed photograph of the children. They were younger then, smaller, their smiles stiff, forced, their faces pale. Taped to the frame was a slip of paper, her delicate handwriting scrawled across it. Obedience is survival. The teacher's stomach twisted. Their hands trembled. She lingered in the doorway for only a moment before stepping fully inside, her figure swallowed by the shadows of the hidden room. The door closed behind her with a dull, final thud, and the lock clicked into place. The hum remained, vibrating faintly through the walls, the heartbeat of a secret sealed away. The teacher did not move. They could not. Their lungs burned with the effort of holding their breath. Their pulse thundered like a drum in their ears. They had just glimpsed the truth she had built walls around. This wasn't only about control. It wasn't only about her children. This was something deeper, something dangerous enough to bury inside a fortress, guarded by locks and shadows. And now the teacher knew too much, because in that house, anyone who saw what wasn't meant to be seen never lasted long. The night after the teacher witnessed the mother unlocking the hidden room, sleep became impossible. They lay in bed, staring into the dark, their mind replaying the image over and over, the glint of the keys in her hand, the hum that pulsed like a heartbeat from behind the steel door, the photograph of the children with that cruel message taped across it. Obedience is survival. Every sound in the mansion seemed amplified. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a warning. Every gust of wind against the windows pressed like a breath at the back of their neck. The knowledge weighed on them like iron shackles. They had crossed into something forbidden, and there would be no way back. The next morning unfolded like a dream dipped in dread. The children entered the study as usual, but their bodies carried exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleepless nights and everything to do with fear. Their shoulders sagged, their eyes were dull, their voices hollow. They opened their books and turned the pages, but their words were empty when they read aloud, like lines recited without meaning. The teacher tried to steady their own voice, but it trembled in places, the memory of the locked room rattling inside their chest. And then the eldest did something different. He did not even pretend to read. His book lay unopened in front of him. His dark eyes were fixed on the teacher, sharp, unblinking, studying every movement. His silence pressed heavier than the muttered recitations of his siblings. He was waiting, measuring, weighing the truth that trembled just beneath the surface. When the lesson ended, the younger children slipped out quickly, grateful to escape the suffocating air of the study. But the eldest remained. He sat perfectly still, his elbows on the desk, his eyes never leaving the teacher's face. The silence grew unbearable, stretching longer with each passing second, until finally he broke it. His voice was low, measured, and dangerous in its certainty. "You saw it, didn't you?" The teacher froze. The boy leaned forward, his gaze narrowing. "The room," he whispered. "You heard the hum. You saw her open it." The teacher's throat went dry. They tried to deflect, to deny, but his lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Don't bother," he said. "I know that look. They had it tooth others before she got rid of them." His words were sharp as knives, each syllable slicing through the quiet. The others, tutors who had lasted long, enough to see too much, tutors who never returned. His voice dropped even lower, his eyes flicking toward the door as though it might sprout ears. "That room isn't just hers. It's ours. Or at least it should be. Everything in there belongs to us, but she won't let us near it. She says it's dangerous, that we wouldn't understand. But that's not true. It isn't danger she's keeping out. It's truth." The teacher's heart pounded as they leaned closer, whispering, "Truth about what?" The boy's jaw clenched, his voice trembling with something caught between anger and grief. He hesitated, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, as if speaking the words might tear the air apart. Finally, his voice cracked, raw and bitter, "About our mother." The room seemed to tilt around the teacher. The boy's eyes burned with a fury that had been caged for too long. He gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. "She tells us our mother was weak, that she left, that she couldn't handle us, couldn't handle this life. But I know that's a lie. She didn't leave. She wouldn't. She loved us. She promised she'd never leave." His voice faltered, and for the first time, his composure broke. His lower lip trembled, and his eyes filled with the grief of years. Now she's just gone. Vanished. The teacher's chest tightened. Each word felt like a stone dropped into dark water, rippling wider and deeper. The boy leaned closer, urgency burning in his eyes. "That room has everything, files, records, proof of what really happened to her, proof of what she did. That's why she keeps it locked. If anyone ever saw what's inside, it wouldn't just ruin her. It would destroy her." Before the teacher could respond, his posture snapped back into rigid control. His eyes darted to the door, his voice retreating into a mutter. "Don't ask me again. If she even suspects I told you this, it'll be worse for both of us." He gathered his books with shaky hands and left the study without another glance. The door shut softly behind him, but the weight of his confession lingered. The teacher sat in silence, their pulse racing, the boy's words echoing in their mind. Proof of what she did to our mother. For the first time since stepping into the mansion, the teacher understood. The children were not only prisoners of their mother's control, they were keepers of a secret so dangerous it could burn the entire empire she had built. And now, the teacher carried a piece of that truth with them, a truth the mother would do anything to keep buried. The air inside the mansion shifted after that day. At first, the change was subtle, almost invisible, but once the teacher noticed it, they could not unsee it. The silence seemed to press harder against the walls. The echo of footsteps grew sharper, as though every sound carried accusation. The children moved differently, their once fluid mischief now replaced with careful steps and measured glances. They whispered less, laughed less, and when they did, their laughter had a hollow ring, as if they feared the sound itself might betray them. But it wasn't only the children. It was her. The mother had grown watchful. She no longer passed the study with the distracted grace of a woman too powerful to bother with her children's lessons. Now she lingered, Sometimes her shadow would stretch across the doorway, her heels pausing in the corridor just long enough for the teacher's voice to falter. Sometimes she stood at the threshold, silent, her eyes sharp as daggers, watching. Other times, the teacher could feel her presence behind them, as if she were studying every word, every glance, every breath. At meals, she began to probe with questions wrapped in silk. "What did you learn today?" she would ask, her tone sweet and casual, but her gaze was unblinking, dissecting every syllable of her children's replies. The eldest answered carefully, his words clipped and precise. The middle child stumbled through short phrases, his usual wit stifled by the weight of her eyes. The youngest barely spoke at all, chewing silently as though afraid that even the scrape of a fork against porcelain might give him away. The teacher felt it too, that suffocating scrutiny, the unspoken suspicion that hung heavy in the air like smoke. One evening, after the lessons had ended and the children had been sent to their rooms, the teacher remained behind in the study. They stacked books with deliberate slowness, trying to calm the storm in their chest. That was when they heard it, the click of heels approaching. Slow, certain, each step striking the marble like a drumbeat. The teacher turned just as the mother entered the room. "They've kept you longer than most," she said, her voice smooth but laced with something darker. "I must admit, I'm surprised." Her silhouette filled the doorway, her figure framed in golden light, her posture flawless as always. Her eyes moved across the study, settling finally on the teacher. "The others didn't last. My children can be difficult, resistant, sometimes cruel. But you've managed to win their cooperation." The teacher forced a polite nod, but inside their chest tightened. Her words were not a compliment. They were a probe, a test, each syllable carefully sharpened to slice through defenses. She stepped further into the room, her perfume filling the air. "Tell me," she said softly, "what do you think of them? My children. Be honest." The question hung like a trap. If the teacher spoke too kindly, it would suggest loyalty shifting toward the children. Too harsh, and it would mark them as an outsider. Either way, the mother would measure the answer and find meaning in it. The teacher's voice came slowly, steady, every word weighed with care. "They're intelligent, strong-willed. They just need guidance." For a fleeting second, something flickered across her perfect face. Annoyance, perhaps even fear. It vanished almost instantly, replaced by her practiced smile, but the teacher had seen it. "Guidance," she repeated. "Yes, that's why I choose their tutors so carefully." Her gaze lingered on the word tutors, the sweetness in her tone fraying at the edges, revealing the steel beneath. That night, the teacher barely touched their food. At the long dining table, her eyes never left them. Every movement, every breath felt examined, catalogued, stored. The children stayed silent, their shoulders stiff, their heads bowed low. Even the sound of cutlery on porcelain seemed too loud in the thick, watchful quiet. Later, as the teacher walked the dim corridor toward their chamber, they caught sight of her at the far end of the hall. She wasn't moving, wasn't speaking, just standing in the shadows, her face hidden, her body still. When the teacher's eyes met hers, she turned and disappeared into the dark without a word. The eldest child had been right, she knew. She didn't need proof yet. She could smell secrets the way a predator scents blood. She had sensed the shift in her children's eyes, in the teacher's voice, in the fragile crack forming in the illusion she had so carefully built. And now, the teacher realized with a shiver, they were no longer simply an outsider brought in to teach. In her eyes, they had become something far more dangerous. They were a threat. And in this house, threats did not last long.